各位观众，大家好，我是卡拉，欢迎收看《美国观察》。拜登总统周二签署降低通货膨胀法案，希望达到缓解通胀、减少家庭医药支出、推进清洁能源等目标。今天的节目中，我们共同关注。拜登总统周二在白宫签署了国会以党派划线通过的降低通货膨胀法案。他强调，这份法案能够造福美国人民，除了增加医疗保险人数、减少家庭医药支出，也推进清洁能源跟对抗气候变化的目标，同时还能降低赤字，对抗通货膨胀。详细情况，请美国之音白宫记者黄耀义来介绍。耀义。
拜登总统在8月16号星期二从度假的南卡罗来纳州回到了白宫，在当中呢签署了国会之前通过的这个解决降低通膨法案。那么这个法案呢，是获得了全数民主党人的支持，没有共和党人投下赞成票。那么该法案呢，也被视为能够为民主党在其中大选之前带来活力。那么这一项总值达4300亿美元的降低通膨法案呢，拜登总统强调说，这个法案将能够来照顾美国人民的健康，包括降低处方药价、医疗保险等等。那么白宫也发出了声明，表示在这个健康保险方面呢，这个美国人现在的处方药价是其他国家人民的2到3倍。那在这个法案通过之后，有5000万的联邦医疗保险的处方药保险者，也就是 Part D， 他们的药房的开销呢将会只有2000元的上限。另外呢，也会有330万的联邦保险糖尿病的患者，他们的胰岛素的开销每个月的上限也只会有35元。此外呢，会增加300万的美国人获得医疗保险。那目前呢，美国没有获得医疗保险的这个比例只有8%，也是历史的新低。那拜登总统在签署法案的同时呢，也指出，除了医疗保险方面来照顾美国人民的民生之外，该法案同时也是美国史上最大的气候变化法案。我们看一下拜登总统今天在白宫怎么说。
The Inflation Reduction Act invests $369 billion to take the most aggressive action ever in confronting the climate crisis and strengthening our energy security. This bill is the biggest step forward on climate ever.
拜登总统这个白宫后来发出的声明当中，也特别列出了这项法案将能够给美国人民在清洁能源方面的推动以及免税的部分，包括如果你是申请清洁能源或电动车免税的家庭，每年就可以省超过1000美元。那如果你是购买节能家电的家庭，每年能省至少350美元。那么还有很多，包括像购买新的电动车可以获得最高7500美元的免税额等等。那他们表示呢，这个法案将能推动拜登政府的气候目标。那平均每个家庭以后1年可以平均省500元的这个能源的花费，同时呢还能够为美国来创造数百万的高薪工作。不过当然大家也非常关注，如果有这么多的开销，包括医疗保险或者是清洁能源的话，那这些钱要从哪里来？白宫表示说呢，光是从这个制造业，还有把供应链拉回美国，以及创造高薪的工作，就能够创造许多的这个收入之外呢，还包括了要与这个最大的企业、最富有的这个美国顶尖的人来让他们公平的赋税，也可以来补这些税务的漏洞。那白宫就指出呢，在税务公平方面，在2020年就有55家最大而且最富有的美国企业是不需要缴交任何联邦所得税的。白宫说这并不公平。那所以呢，在这个方面要把一些税务上的漏洞给补起来。但他同时也强调呢，年所得低于40万美元的家庭，他们的税将不会上升。那白宫也指出呢，这个法案这样预计在今年的赤字将会减少超过1.5万亿美元，光在去年就已经减少超过了3500亿美元。那么白宫说，126位的顶尖科学家分析，减少赤字会带来好的后果，就是有助于对抗通货膨胀，并且支撑坚强稳定的经济成长。那我们也知道呢，解决通货膨胀是11月的其中大选当中一个关注的焦点。那拜登政府呢，也打算聚焦说，在他任内不到2年之内，就已经通过诸多包括了经济、国安跟民生法案，希望能够获得选民的选票。那么在今天参加这个签署仪式的多数党的这个领袖舒默参议员呢，也特别的强调了这一点。我们看一下舒默参议员今天在白宫怎么说。
Has been one of the most productive stretches in Senate history, from the first gun safety bill in decades, to strengthening NATO, to outcompeting the Chinese Communist Party, to taking care of our veterans. And to top it all off, we celebrate a groundbreaking achievement, the most important bill we have passed in a long time. President Biden will sign the Inflation Reduction Act into law today.
那么同时呢，这个西维吉尼亚州的参议员曼青参议员呢，今天也在白宫里面接受记者的访问。那么我就问他说呢，他说供应链的这个短缺呢，是造成目前通货膨胀主要的原因之一。另外一个就是乌克兰的战争。那我就问他说呢，这个供应链在还没有在美国重组之前，是否对于放松某部分的中国关税，在短期之内对美国的民生会有所帮助？对此呢，曼青参议员回应我说呢，美国自己本身必须要增强自己本身的供应链的强度，所以是美国自己本身要做得更好。那么中国这样方面怎么做呢？他管不着。卡拉，
好的，感谢耀义从白宫发回的报道。美国国会代表团本周访问台湾，会晤蔡英文总统。中国解放军东部战区多军兵种部队又在台湾周边海空域举行了实战化演训。星期二，北京对新一批被列入清单的所谓台独顽固分子等人员实施制裁，禁止这些人及其家属进入中国大陆及港澳地区。台湾政府随后表达抗议，强调两岸互不隶属，制裁非法无效。我们现在连线美国之音驻国务院记者站主任张荣香来了解详情。荣香给我们介绍一下美国国务院对于台海局势有怎么样最新的说明？
美国政府表示，美国议员访问台湾是获得两党支持、行之有年的政策。美国希望中国呢不要过度反应对议员们对台湾在台湾所进行的和平访问来过度反应，也不要采取措施来片面的、单方面的改变台海的现状。我们知道，在美国国会众议院议长佩洛西访问台湾、离开台湾之后呢，中国在台海周围进行了军事演习，其中呢有几枚的弹道导弹呢落入了这个日本的经济区。对此，美国政府已经表示了关切。那么今天呢，美国国务院表示，当美国在亚太地区的盟友面对可能的威胁或是遭到恐吓的时候呢，美国会坚定的和美国在亚太的盟友站在一起。我们知道，在美国国会参议院民主党的参议员马基访问台湾并且离开台湾之后呢，中国宣布最新一波的对台湾政要官员的制裁名单，里面呢包括了台湾的驻美代表萧美琴以及台湾的国安会秘书长辜立雄等等。那么在这之前呢，台湾的立法院长游锡堃以及台湾的外交部长吴钊燮呢，都已经是被列为这个制裁的黑名单里面。那么在佩洛西议长访问台湾之后呢，中国也宣称要对佩洛西和他的直系亲属来进行制裁。对此，美国国务院今天表示，无法核实其他政府对美国公民的制裁内容，也不会评论中国针对台湾官员所施加的制裁措施。而这些制裁措施呢，必须由中国来对外说明其中的细节。那么，针对马基这个参议员，民主党的参议员马基离开台湾之后呢，中国在这个星期的一系列的行动，美国国务院的发言人内德·普莱斯也在例行记者会当中呢再次重申，美国议员访问台湾是和平的访问，行之有年。下面我们来看看他是怎么说的。
Any reaction to the peaceful visit of a member of Congress, in this case, the Speaker of the House, any reaction along those lines is an overreaction. As we've said, members of Congress have every right to visit Taiwan. Members of Congress have done so for decades. A previous Speaker of the House has visited Taiwan. Congressional delegations have been to Taiwan many times this year, more than 10 times this year.
好的，以上是美国之音驻国务院记者站主任张荣香的报道。美国军方星期二表示，因为俄罗斯入侵乌克兰和北京在台海举行大规模军演而被美国军方主动推迟2次的民兵3型洲际弹道导弹发射试验圆满完成。美国军方发表了声明表示，导弹试射展示了美国核武部队的战备状态，并提升了对国家核威慑法理和效力的决心。民兵3型洲际弹道导弹最近一次试射预定本月早些时候进行，但是中 中国由于强烈不满美国国会众议院议长佩洛西访台，而在台海周边海空域举行了长达1个星期的大规模实弹演习。美国军方为了顾全大局，避免中国军方误解误判，公开宣布推迟这一洲际弹道导弹的发射试验。可以配备核弹头的民兵3型洲际弹道导弹由波音公司制造，是美国核武库中的利器。该导弹射程超过9660公里，飞行速度大约每小时24000公里。美国、韩国和日本刚刚完成了一次弹道导弹防御演习，这标志着韩国朝着与日本改善双边关系的目标迈出了一大步，也显示韩国新政府愿意承受北京的压力，为自身国家主权与安全以及地区和平与稳定而深化美日韩3国安全合作。五角大楼星期一在一份新闻稿中说，从8月8日至14日，美国、日本和韩国的海军力量聚集在夏威夷海上太平洋导弹射击场，参与了一次导弹预警和弹道导弹搜寻和追踪演习，并依据3方信息共享协定分享了相关数据。3国高级官员今年多次发表共同声明，表达要共同应对朝鲜的威胁，强调在南中国海问题上遵守国际法，以及维护台湾海峡安全与稳定的重要性。中国反对美日韩在地区安全事务上合作，并不断向首尔施压，要求韩国政府不要与美国和日本维持安全领域的合作。白宫星期二说，美国第1夫人吉尔拜登感染了新冠病毒，星期一夜晚出现了类似感冒的症状。白宫新闻秘书让皮埃尔在一项声明中说，吉尔拜登只有轻度症状，医生已经开具了服用帕罗维德的处方。71岁的第1夫人接种了2剂新冠疫苗和2剂加强针。白宫说，按照美国疾控中心的指导原则，吉尔拜登将隔离至少5天，与他有过密切接触的人已经得到通知。欢迎继续收看《美国观察》。联合国人权高级专员米歇尔·巴切莱特预计将于8月发表新疆人权报告。此前有报道称，中国正在阻止巴切莱特发布该报告。新疆人权问题知名学者郑国恩在接受美国之音专访时表示，中国政府的新疆政策已经发生转向，国际压力将持续发挥作用。
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhang, for speaking with the Voice of America. Chinese President Xi Jinping made a rare visit to Xinjiang in July, his first visit there in 8 years. How do you read the timing and the purpose of this visit?
It is quite interesting that Xi is visiting Xinjiang for the first time since 2014, given the risks in the area and the fact that a bomb attack occurred during his last visit in Urumqi in 2014. So I think his visit really demonstrates that the Chinese government feels very secure now about the general security in the area, about the success of central government policy, and about the fact that, Beijing is in firm control over the region.
Speaking of the security, we noticed that Xi Jinping's public remarks in Xinjiang did not mention eradicating extremism and separatism, which Chinese officials have long cited as a rationale for their severe Xinjiang policies. Why? What's your take on this?
My take is that, as Xi himself also remarked in 2020 at the third Xinjiang Work Conference, that Xinjiang has made great progress or success in regards to the central government's attempt to eradicate extremism. Of course, this did occur through brutal re-educational brainwashing. But from the central government's perspective, it clearly appears that China has been successful in eliminating the problems of extremism that it sees there, or at least that's what it publicly portrays. If you look at some of the internal government documents, they often are far more alarming than what the government says itself. And actually, if you look at some of the Xinjiang work reports, like, for example, the report for 2021, published at the beginning of this year, and other reports that are not quite as outward-facing, the tenor still is that Xinjiang still faces arduous challenges for stability. But I think Xi Jinping's visit here was to send a message of confidence.
According to the Xinjiang police files, it was during and after the 2014 visit that Xi Jinping laid the groundwork for the crackdown, the mass detention, surveillance, and other controversial Xinjiang policies. Do you expect any new policy or policy change after his 2022 visit?
I think this policy change has already taken place. We can see that under Chen Quanguo, Xinjiang was implementing a very intensified campaign-style mobilizational approach, mass mobilization for mass internment, mass mobilization into labor transfers, etc. Everything was high-powered. It was police state style, ultimately quite unsustainable. Now, an internal Chinese academic report called the Nankai Report said that the internment camps were a effective and necessary short-term measure, but that the long-term measure is development and labor transfer and poverty alleviation. I think we are seeing this shift, which I analyzed in my publication from June this year. We are seeing that under Ma Xingrui and under the new, the 14th five-year plan for the region, there's now a focus on sustainability, on long-term development, away from this highly mobilizational campaign style a way of governing and policy making to a more institutionalized, a normalization of coercive labor, of coercive poverty alleviation, and of securitization, including people locked up in prisons still for a long time.
You once wrote the preemptive internment of large numbers of ordinary citizens can be explained as a devolution into political paranoia that promotes exaggerated threat perceptions. Would you please elaborate on this? What do you mean by political paranoia?
Political paranoia is a concept that has long been developed by scholars of mass atrocity, scholars of genocide. People, academics who have studied the likes of Mao, of Stalin, of Pol Pot, of Idi Amin, of Hitler, of other regimes that implemented mass atrocities. And it was clear how a paranoid mindset that exaggerates an existing threat, but very limited threat, exaggerates it to an extent of justifying the preemptive internment or oppression or even destruction of an ethnic group that's framed as a threat. In the case of the Uyghurs, yes, Uyghurs have perpetrated acts of violent resistance. They have committed knife attacks, even attacks we could call terrorism to an extent, small minorities, of course. So this threat is construed as this incredible threat emanating from the entire ethnic group, where every Uyghur has the potential to somehow become this monster in their minds and take a knife and kill somebody. And so then in the mind of the central government and the government, you have to take them and preemptively put them in camps to make sure that they don't become dangerous because they're already untrustworthy. And so the dynamics of political paranoia explain how a regime can suddenly shift into a mode of mass internment, of mass oppression, in order to satisfy its own fears, basically.
What's the cause of this kind of mindset? Is there any kind of deep reasons behind it?
Well, it is likely a need for control. Autocracies typically feel a need to control a situation. And if you have an entire ethnic group that you feel you can't control them and are not trustworthy, that's how this develops very quickly. You have kind of this, of course, these kind of dictatorships already produce their own internal paranoia. I mean, if you look at Putin and how he surrounds himself with the security services and trusts nobody, or Stalin before him, or others, all have their own security services layers, so prevent any opposition. There's no trust in these systems, and these systems breed paranoia.
Given the paranoia of Chinese government, is international pressure working in terms of, forcing them to change their behavior in Xinjiang?
International pressure adds a significant and important long-term cost to the equation. So I think it's not possible to say international pressure is the one thing that's going to somehow change everything, especially not now, since much of it has already happened now in Xinjiang. But international pressure creates a long-term cost variable that adds to the equation that can make a difference if it comes on top of domestic challenges. And it looks like China is facing domestic challenges, economic challenges, and that could make a difference in the medium to long term.
In June, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act went into effect in the U.S., barring products from Xinjiang unless companies can prove that forced labor was not involved. How would you evaluate this law?
Well, this law directly was based on and follows my recommendation from my research paper and testimony at the CCC Commission, the hearing in October 2019. And so I basically argued in my work and my testimony that that the U.S. government needed to assume that goods from Xinjiang are tainted with forced labor because we have two large systems of forced labor coexisting and operating. And so I'm very pleased that finally, with a long delay, but still better late than never, the UFPLA was enacted and is in force. And now it is a matter of enforcing it and of an ongoing monitoring mechanism to monitor not just the situation in Xinjiang, but to also monitor the forced labor situation to other provinces. And my latest research shows that the normalization and institutionalization of labor transfer in Xinjiang is actually dramatically changing the evidence situation, meaning we now have less specific evidence implicating particular companies, as was the case under the highly mobilizational labor transfer campaigns under Chen Quanguo in the previous years. And so it's all the more important that we have a mechanism such as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that says everything coming out of the region could be tainted with forced labor and therefore is unacceptable.
But some people have raised concerns over, the other side of the coin. For example, they argue that as a U.S. business withdraws from Xinjiang, Uyghurs living there might be driven into poverty. Are you concerned about that?
I'm not sure that any single American company has made this argument, but it's of course very likely that Chinese companies have made this argument. But regardless of whoever made this argument, a lot of the business or much of the business in the region, especially the labor transfers, labor transfer takes very low-skilled Uyghurs, very, very low-skilled Uyghurs, and puts them into factories that are set up with expensive subsidies from the central government, from Eastern China. So the factory bosses are Han Chinese, and a lot of those are benefiting from the system are Han Chinese. So those whose profits are getting impacted, not dramatically because many of them can still sell domestically, those whose profit margins are impacted are almost overwhelmingly Han Chinese business owners. The effect on the Uyghurs would be marginal, and if Uyghurs are hit, those would be the wealthy Uyghurs. The poor Uyghurs will not be affected.
Another concern would be how to fulfill the climate change commitment of the U.S. with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Because with the help of forced labor, China has been the dominant supplier of the raw materials used in solar panels and electric vehicles' batteries. So the enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act means the U.S. has to, rebuild the whole supply chains of these industries, which might drag down the transition to new energy. Do you think the U.S. has to choose between, fighting against the climate change and against the human rights violation in China?
Well, the White House is already choosing between this because the Biden administration has, in fact, exempted several of the polysilicon producers that are implicated from the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, to the dismay, of course, of human rights activists. Obviously, China is producing very inexpensively solar panels. That's a situation that's quite recent. Many solar panels were produced in the past in countries like Germany, and they were brought to China due to the systematic advantages and government subsidies. So in many ways, it's the only right and ethical thing to bring business in solar panels back to countries that have ethical labor principles and don't irresponsibly and illegally boost the sector through government subsidies.
What would be your suggestions for the U.S. to do next in terms of helping ethical ethnic groups in Xinjiang?
Work together with allied countries, work together with Europeans, the European Union, work together with Britain, with Canada, try to work with Belt and Road countries and developing countries, even though it's difficult, provide alternatives so that we don't have a situation where a Chinese company makes goods and says, oh, these goods we cannot send to the US, but we can sell them to Africa or to Europe or to Canada. And that would be a big mistake. So I think the United States cannot just act on its own. Also, with the genocide determination, pressure at multilateral institutions, the UN should exert pressure at the UN in Geneva. It should try to exert pressure at all kinds of multilateral settings in order to work towards a difference. The U.S. cannot do this by itself.
According to a recent Reuters report, China is asking the UN High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet to bury a highly anticipated report on human rights violations in Xinjiang. What's your expectation for this report?
It is my understanding that this report is going to be of a nature that's going to make Beijing rightly very, very concerned about it. And China's actions are indicating that the report, that Beijing obviously believes that the report could be quite damaging to its reputation. And from what I am aware of, I would agree that this report, yes, very likely, and almost certainly, hopefully at least, is going to be quite truthful to the situation on the ground. So I'm not surprised that the Chinese are trying to stop it. Ultimately, of course, Michelle Bachelet herself is going to make some sort of decision about what's going to be in the report or not. And that, of course, is a major concern. But I think there's a lot of pressure also on her, and this process is being very closely watched. So hopefully she's not going to tinker.
美国众议院议长佩洛西8月初访问台湾时，北京对台湾发动前所未有的大规模军演及导弹试射。然而，距离中国厦门市仅3.2公里的台湾离岛金门，14万的居民生活一如往常，看不到一丝惊慌。由于经济因素，金门居民对中国军事威胁看法存在分歧。一些金门的居民准备保卫自己的家园，免受中国侵略。
没有，我们不会怕，不会怕，不会跑到这边来。
对于金门的民众来说，我们也是就是正常的上班、正常作息，可能在看新闻稍微感到不安，但基本上就是跟平常一样。对于中共目前的军演还有培训，就整个目前发生到现在，我个人觉得这是我们国家必须要承受的，因为在第一个我们特殊的地理位置跟我们的特殊的历史脉络来说，我们就是在中美2大强权的中间，在整个印太战略里面，我们就是一个棋子。
这个局势真歹讲咯，毋是要吓人惊，也是要情况怎样？这是军事的无法度了解。
当然愿意啊，为什么不愿意呢？台湾才一个而已啊，若是被打掉，那怎么办？说，我是觉得是说，台湾真的是很快乐一个国岛，一个岛国啦啊，因为我也不希望就是有军事发生。若是真的有提升到那个等级的话，我还是很乐意会为国家挺身出来，为台湾而战。
以上就是今天美国观察的全部内容，感谢您的收看，我们下次再见。